Lafayette police data shows a link between local crime and people from Chicago.
Well, statistics show that some crimes are 2 times more likely to be committed by someone with a Chicago connection. News 18's Kelly Roberts has been collecting the data, and she joins us now with the numbers in the first part of her report. Kelly?
Well, good evening, Jeff and Gina. 2 years ago, News 18 looked into a potential link between a migration from Chicago and crime locally. Our reporters spoke with prosecutors and law enforcement who all said they saw a correlation. Now, 2 years later, we're revisiting the investigation to see what the most current statistics show.
I think most people in the community have heard the story about the bus or the several bus loads of people coming from Chicago to Greater Lafayette to receive services.
In October, Lafayette Urban Ministry Executive Director Joe Micon wrote a newsletter called A Promise as Enduring as America. He addressed the idea that people are coming from the Cook County, Illinois area, which includes Chicago, in the masses, to Greater Lafayette to take advantage of social services. And with them, they bring poverty and crime.
Of course they're coming here, it makes sense, but it's not because of our human services or social services. People go someplace for good jobs, they go number 2 for good education, and they go, in the case of folks from Cook County, they're looking for safe streets.
But not everyone believes that. By spending just a little time on social media, you can see some opinions on this idea. As crime stories make the headlines, some blame the crime on people from Chicago, sometimes calling Greater Lafayette Little Chicago. News 18 wanted to see if their suspicions had any merit. Lafayette Police crime analyst Steve Hawthorne drew up data for the last 15 years in all of Tippecanoe County. He was able to break down the data into different groups, including people arrested who were born in Chicago, people arrested with a current address in Chicago, and people arrested with a historic address in Chicago. Since 1999, more than 60,500 people have been arrested by one or more of the 4 law enforcement agencies in the county. 5% of those arrests, or just over 3,000 people, had some kind of Chicago relationship, whether it be a birthplace, a current address, or a historic address. However, Hawthorne says people with a Chicago connection were twice as likely to commit personal or violent crimes or property crimes than people with no Chicago connection. The numbers run the gamut depending on the crime. For example, people with a Chicago connection accounted for 37% of trespassing and threats and 18% of robberies. However, for rape and battery with a deadly weapon, people with a Chicago connection accounted for 4% and 5% respectively. Hawthorne declined to be interviewed for this story. Lafayette Police Chief Patrick Flannelly says data like this is important to how police officers operate nowadays. With dwindling budgets, data allows officers to police with efficiency.
There's been a pretty significant shift in the last 20 years, even in my 20 years on this police department, and how we respond to calls for service, and a lot of that is data driven.
Flannelly says when he saw the arrest data dealing with people with a Chicago relationship, nothing stood out to him as a reason for concern. He says it paints a broad picture, but in the end, a Chicago relationship is not what he cares about.
What did you think about, looking at this 5%, but then also breaking it down? Was there anything that you thought kind of painted a picture of maybe what was happening?
We have to be careful about how we look at things like that. And for us, really, in the end, where somebody is from is irrelevant. It's really about what's the behavior, what are the types of crimes that are occurring.
I can't even give you like the number of years, but many, many years there's been this conception of the migration.
At the Lafayette Housing Authority, which deals with Section 8 housing choice vouchers, Executive Director Michelle Reynolds and Deputy Director Vida Hoyer say a migration from Chicago to town, no matter how big or small, can't be ignored. At the turn of the millennium, the Cabrini Green Public Housing Project in Chicago was beginning to be demolished. The work finished up in 2011. The complex housed more than 15,000 people at its peak, mainly lower-income minorities. Reynolds says some believe those thousands of people displaced by the demolition got Section 8 vouchers and immediately moved to Lafayette.
There is a misconception or a perception that we give priority to Chicago applicants over our residents here. and that's simply untrue.
Lafayette Housing Authority compiled 18 years of data for those who came to the office to use the services with a Section 8 voucher. In technical terminology, this is called porting in.
That data shows over that time span, only 10% used their vouchers and ported into Tippecanoe County. On the other side of it, over the same time period, we had 35% has transferred out of Tippecanoe County back up to Chicago or Cook County.
If you do not have a voucher, you must be a Tippecanoe County resident and or work in Tippecanoe County to be put on a waiting list for Lafayette Housing Authority services. Maisha Stepney moved from Chicago 8 years ago without a voucher. She spent more than 6 months on the waiting list.
It's not like you come from Chicago and say you're here a week and then you get on Section 8 and you live, you know. It's not like that, but they won't turn you down. They will help you if you're from Chicago or not.
Stepney has heard of the idea about a migration from Chicago bringing negative effects to town, but she says she moved here to make a better life for herself and her kids.
Sometimes it's people come from Chicago who they bring, and it's not everyone from Chicago. It can be a handful. It can be like one bad apple spoils the bunch.
Tomorrow we'll hear more from Maisha Stepney and others who made the move from Chicago to Tippecanoe County. They explain in detail the reasons for coming. Also, I'll look at whether there are any racial undertones when talking about people from Chicago. Some diversity leaders say the idea of a migration from Chicago is an example of how racism is evolving. That's tomorrow on News 18 at 6 and 11. We have this story up right now on WLFI.com with links to our original 2012 investigation. You can also find a breakdown of crimes and percentages with a Chicago connection on our website. Kelly Roberts, News 18.